Kethvar stood before the massive viewing screen in his quarters, watching the blue marble of Earth grow larger as his ship approached. The planet looked peaceful from space, covered in white clouds and blue oceans. It reminded him of his home world, except for the strange green and brown patches that covered the land masses. The Zephyrian warrior had seen many worlds during his 300 years of military service. He had fought in 12 major conflicts across the galaxy, earning medals and honors that covered most of his chest armor. His purple skin bore the ritual scars of victory, and his 4 arms moved with the practiced grace of a veteran soldier. There was little in the universe that could surprise him anymore. At least, that's what he thought. The message from the Galactic Council had been simple: evaluate the military potential of the species called humans. These newcomers wanted to join the Council, and every species needed a military assessment before membership could be considered. It was routine work, the kind given to experienced officers who could handle diplomatic duties, along with their analysis. Kethvar had read the basic files on humans during his journey. They were young, having only discovered faster-than-light travel 50 years ago. Their technology was basic compared to most Council races. They had no energy shields, no plasma weapons, no gravitic manipulation systems. Their ships still used chemical propulsion for atmospheric flight and simple fusion drives for space travel. Most amusing of all, they still fought with kinetic weapons. Bullets and missiles, like primitive species used before they learned to harness pure energy. The humans called these weapons firearms and seemed quite proud of them. Kethvar had chuckled at that. His own people had abandoned such crude tools over 1,000 years ago. The orbital station around Earth was a modest affair, clearly built for trade rather than defense. As Kethvar's ship docked, he noted the simple construction and basic materials. Everything about human space infrastructure suggested a peaceful, possibly naive species that had stumbled into interstellar capability without understanding the dangers of the galaxy. Ambassador Chen Wei greeted him at the airlock. The human was smaller than Kethvar expected, barely reaching the alien warrior's shoulder. The ambassador had gray hair and wore a simple black suit. His smile seemed genuine, and his handshake was firm but not aggressive. "Welcome to Earth orbit, Commander Kethvar," Chen said in accented but clear galactic standard. "We're honored that the Council sent someone of your reputation to assess us." Kethvar nodded politely. The human's dossier had mentioned his background as a former military officer, but looking at the small, aging man, it was hard to imagine him as a warrior. "Thank you, Ambassador. I look forward to learning about your people's military capabilities." Chen led him through the station to a conference room where several other humans waited. They introduced themselves as generals, admirals, and defense ministers. All appeared to be older individuals with gray or white hair. None looked particularly imposing, though Kethvar noted they carried themselves with a certain confidence. "We've prepared presentations on our current military structure," said General Martinez, a woman with short gray hair and calm eyes. "Our fleet composition, ground forces, and defensive capabilities." The presentations were exactly what Kethvar expected. Human military forces were tiny compared to major galactic powers. Their largest warships carried maybe 50 crew members, while Zephyrian battlecruisers held thousands. Human ground forces numbered in the millions globally, which sounded impressive until you considered that most Council species could field billions of soldiers. Their weapons were indeed kinetic-based, though humans had developed some interesting variations. Railguns that used magnetic acceleration, missiles with sophisticated guidance systems, and something called smart ammunition that could change course after being fired. Primitive, but clever, in its own way. The most striking thing about the presentations was how matter-of-fact the humans were about everything. They showed no boasting or false pride. When Admiral Thompson explained their space fleet, he readily admitted their ships were slower and less heavily armed than most galactic standards. When General Kim discussed their ground forces, she openly acknowledged their lack of energy weapons and force fields. We know we're behind the curve technologically, Chen said during a break in the presentations. We're hoping council membership will help us learn and grow. Kethvar found their honesty refreshing after dealing with species that constantly exaggerated their capabilities. These humans seemed to understand their limitations. They appeared to be exactly what they claimed, a young, peaceful species hoping to find their place in the larger galaxy. After the formal presentations, Chen offered to show Kethvar around the station. They visited the small military section, where human soldiers demonstrated their equipment. The weapons were well maintained, and the soldiers moved with discipline. But nothing about them suggested any particular threat or advantage over standard galactic forces. There is one thing I'd like to request, Kethvar said, as they returned to the conference room. For my report to be complete, I should review your species' military history. Understanding how your forces developed will help me assess their potential for future growth. The humans exchanged glances. Chen cleared his throat. Of course, Commander. We can arrange access to our historical military databases. How far back would you like to go? Known. As far as your records extend, Kethvar replied. I find that a species' martial traditions often reveal important aspects of their character and potential. Very well, Chen said, though something in his tone suggested hesitation. We'll set up a secure terminal for you, with access to our complete military historical archives. I should warn you, human history contains some difficult periods. We haven't always been at our best. In 22, I'm in third, he says. Kethvar nodded dismissively. Every species had periods of internal conflict before achieving galactic capability. The Zephyrians themselves had gone through centuries of clan warfare before uniting under the banner of stars. These humans seemed so gentle and reasonable that their historical conflicts were probably minor disputes over resources or territory. I appreciate the warning, Ambassador. But I've studied the military history of dozens of species. I doubt anything in your records will surprise me. Chen's expression suggested he disagreed, but he simply nodded. The terminal will be ready for you tomorrow morning. Take all the time you need. End quote. That evening, as Kethvar prepared for sleep in his guest quarters, he felt satisfied with his progress. The assessment would be straightforward. Humans were a peaceful, technologically limited species, with modest military capabilities, but good potential for growth under Council guidance. They would make suitable junior members, probably specializing in trade or scientific research rather than military applications. He had no idea that tomorrow would begin the most disturbing education of his long military career. Kethvar activated the human terminal and began his research with confidence. The interface was simple but functional, and the database contained thousands of years of recorded human military history. He decided to start from the beginning, working his way forward through time to understand how human warfare had evolved. The first entries were about something called ancient warfare. Kethvar expected to read about small tribal conflicts, maybe disputes between early city-states. Most species went through similar phases before developing more civilized approaches to conflict resolution. He was wrong. The first major entry describes something called the Punic Wars between two human civilizations called Rome and Carthage. Kethvar read the numbers 3 times before he could believe them. Over 600,000 casualties in the battles of the Second Punic War alone. This was just one conflict between 2 early human states, fought with nothing but metal weapons and muscle power. The scale was staggering. At the Battle of Cannae, a human general named Hannibal had killed or captured nearly 70,000 enemy soldiers in a single day. Kethvar had to check the translation twice. The entire Zephyrian clan that had conquered his home continent had numbered fewer than 50,000 warriors, and that campaign had taken years to complete. He continued reading about Roman warfare and felt his confidence begin to crack. Romans didn't just defeat enemies. They destroyed them completely. When the city of Carthage finally fell, Roman soldiers spent 17 days burning it to the ground and sold every surviving civilian into slavery. The Romans then salted the earth, so nothing could ever grow there again. This wasn't warfare, as Kethvar understood it. This was systematic erasure of an enemy's entire existence. The database had video reconstructions of Roman military tactics. Kethvar watched formations of human soldiers moving with mechanical precision, their shields locked together in patterns called testudo, or turtle formation. These humans fought in perfect coordination without any technological assistance, no mental links or communication implants. They achieved unity through discipline and training alone. Roman armies conquered most of their known world using nothing but iron weapons, wooden siege engines, and tactical brilliance. They built an empire that lasted over 1,000 years. When Kethvar calculated the total casualties from Roman campaigns, the number exceeded the population of most entire star systems. But Romans were just the beginning. The next major section covered something called the Mongol conquests. Kethvar read about a human named Genghis Khan and his descendants, who conquered the largest continuous land empire in human history. The Mongols did this while riding animals called horses and using bows that fired sharp sticks. The casualty estimates made Kethvar's hands shake. Conservative numbers suggested Mongol campaigns killed over 40 million humans. Some historians estimated the death toll at 70 million, or more. This was roughly equivalent to wiping out several entire star systems, accomplished by humans who didn't even have gunpowder yet. The Mongols had tactical innovations that impressed even Kethvar's experienced military mind. They used psychological warfare, spreading terror ahead of their armies, so enemies would surrender without fighting. They employed false retreats to draw enemies into ambushes. They adapted their tactics to fight in forests, deserts, cities, and open plains with equal effectiveness. Most disturbing was their approach to siege warfare. When cities resisted, Mongols would sometimes build pyramids from the skulls of everyone inside. They once diverted an entire river to flood a city that had killed some of their ambassadors. The message was clear: submit or be completely destroyed. Kethvar took a break to process what he was reading. These weren't the actions of a primitive species learning about warfare. These were the strategies of military geniuses who understood conflict on a level that rivaled or surpassed most modern galactic civilizations. He returned to the terminal and found sections on medieval European warfare. Humans had developed systems where professional warriors called knights dominated battlefields through superior training and equipment. But even more interesting were the tactical innovations that came from common soldiers. English longbowmen could fire arrows with enough force to penetrate armor at 300 meters. Swiss pikemen developed formations that could stop cavalry charges dead. Human military engineers built siege weapons that could throw stones weighing several tons over castle walls. The medieval period also showed human adaptability in warfare. When gunpowder arrived from the east, European armies quickly learned to combine traditional tactics with explosive weapons. They didn't abandon what worked, they improved it and added new capabilities. But what truly disturbed Kethvar was the casualty tolerance these ancient humans displayed. The 100 Years' War between England and France lasted over a century and devastated entire regions. Populations declined by 50% or more in some areas. Yet both sides kept fighting, generation after generation, never considering surrender despite losses that would have broken most galactic civilizations. The Battle of Towton during England's Wars of the Roses reportedly killed over 20,000 soldiers in a single day's fighting. The entire battle was fought in a snowstorm using hand weapons. Bodies were stacked so high that men climbed over piles of corpses to continue fighting. When the battle ended, the snow was red with blood for miles around. Kethvar found records of the Viking raids that had terrorized Europe for centuries. These humans sailed across dangerous oceans in wooden boats, seeking battle and plunder. They didn't just fight for territory or resources. They fought because their religion promised paradise to warriors who died in combat. Vikings would deliberately seek out the most dangerous fights available. The database included something called berserkers, Viking warriors who fought in trance states that made them nearly immune to pain and fear. These humans would charge into battle wearing minimal armor, relying on fury and aggression to overwhelm enemies. Many Viking sagas described warriors fighting on after receiving wounds that should have been immediately fatal. As Kethvar read deeper into human ancient history, patterns began emerging that disturbed him more than the raw casualty numbers. Humans didn't just fight, they innovated constantly. Every conflict produced new weapons, new tactics, new ways to kill more effectively. They also showed remarkable persistence. Most galactic species would negotiate or surrender when facing overwhelming odds. Humans seemed to prefer fighting to the death. The Battle of Thermopylae described 300 Spartan warriors holding off a Persian army estimated at over 100,000 soldiers. The Spartans knew they would die, but they fought anyway to buy time for their city-state to prepare defenses. When Kethvar finally stopped reading for the day, his head was spinning. He had covered less than 2,000 years of human history and already seen enough warfare to account for the complete military history of most galactic civilizations. The worst part was that humans had accomplished all this destruction using primitive technology. No energy weapons, no shields, no advanced materials. Just metal tools, human intelligence, and an apparently unlimited willingness to kill and die for their causes. As he prepared for sleep, Kethvar tried to reconcile what he had read with the polite, reasonable humans he had met. Ambassador Chen and his colleagues seemed incapable of the savagery described in these historical records. Yet, the evidence was clear and well documented. Tomorrow he would continue reading, moving into more recent periods of human history. Surely as humans became more civilized, their warfare would become less brutal and more reasonable. He had no idea how wrong he was about to be proven. Kethvar had barely slept. Dreams of human warriors on horseback, Roman legions, and Viking berserkers had haunted his rest. He told himself that surely the worst was behind him. As humans developed better technology and more sophisticated societies, their warfare must have become more civilized and limited in scope. He settled at the terminal and jumped ahead several centuries to what the database called the Industrial Age. Humans had developed steam power, improved metallurgy, and basic chemistry by this point. Surely more advanced civilizations fought more reasonable wars. The first major conflict he studied was called the Great War, or World War I. The casualty figures made him check the translation again. Over 15 million dead. Over 20 million wounded. These numbers represented more lives lost than existed on many entire worlds. But the numbers alone didn't capture the true horror of what humans had done to each other. Kethvar read about trenches that stretched for hundreds of kilometers across entire continents. Millions of human soldiers lived in muddy holes in the ground for years, sleeping alongside rats and corpses, fighting for small patches of devastated land. The battlefield descriptions reminded him of descriptions of hell from various galactic religions. The weapons humans had developed chilled his blood. Poison gas that burned lungs and blinded soldiers. Artillery shells filled with metal fragments that could kill dozens of men at once. Machine guns that fired hundreds of rounds per minute, cutting down advancing troops like grain before a harvester. At the Battle of the Somme, human armies suffered over 1 million casualties to advance the front lines less than 8 kilometers. On the first day alone, 60,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. They kept attacking for 4 months, knowing that each assault would result in massive casualties, yet never stopping their offensive. The Battle of Verdun lasted 10 months. French and German armies fed men into a meat grinder that consumed over 700,000 casualties. Soldiers called it the Mill on the Meuse because it ground up human lives with mechanical efficiency. Units would march to the front with full strength and return with less than 10% of their men alive. What disturbed Kethvar most was the industrial nature of this warfare. Humans had turned killing into a manufacturing process. Factories produced millions of artillery shells, Chemical plants created tons of poison gas. Entire economies were reorganized to support the war effort. But World War I was just the beginning. World War II made the first global conflict look restrained by comparison. The casualties exceeded 60 million dead, with additional millions wounded, displaced, or missing. Entire cities were erased from existence. Populations were systematically murdered on an industrial scale. Kethvar read about something called the Holocaust and had to stop reading twice to compose himself. Humans had built facilities specifically designed to murder other humans as efficiently as possible. They used poisonous gas, mass shootings, and worked people to death in labor camps. The systematic nature of the killing was more disturbing than any battlefield slaughter. Over 6 million humans died in these death camps, along with millions of others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. They didn't just kill enemies. They murdered civilians, including children, elderly people, and anyone who didn't fit their racial theories. The atomic weapons used against Japan introduced a level of destruction that shocked even Kethvar's experienced mind. A single bomb could destroy an entire city and kill over 100,000 people instantly. Humans had developed these weapons specifically to target civilian populations, not military forces. The strategic bombing campaigns of World War II involved deliberately targeting civilian areas to break enemy morale. Cities like Dresden, Tokyo, and Hiroshima were burned to the ground with their populations inside. This wasn't collateral damage. It was intentional targeting of non-combatants. Kethvar studied the Battle of Stalingrad, where human armies fought building by building, room by room through an entire city. The battle lasted over 5 months and resulted in nearly 2 million casualties. Soldiers fought in sewers, subway tunnels, and bombed out ruins with hand-to-hand combat that resembled ancient warfare more than modern military operations. The Pacific Theater showed human naval warfare at its most devastating. Carrier battles involved hundreds of aircraft and dozens of ships fighting across thousands of kilometers of ocean. The kamikaze attacks by Japanese pilots involved deliberately crashing planes into enemy ships, using the aircraft and pilot as guided missiles. But what truly unsettled Kethvar was how efficiently humans had learned to wage total war. They targeted enemy infrastructure, disrupted food supplies, and attacked the civilian population's will to fight. The concept of total war meant that entire societies became legitimate military targets. Human submarines hunted merchant ships carrying food and supplies. Strategic bombers targeted factories, railways, and power plants. Resistance fighters behind enemy lines sabotaged communications and assassinated officials. Every aspect of civilization became part of the war effort. The logistics of these conflicts amazed Kethvar, despite their horrific nature. Humans had coordinated military operations across multiple continents simultaneously. The D-Day invasion involved over 150,000 soldiers landing on enemy beaches in a single day, supported by thousands of ships and aircraft. The Manhattan Project, which developed atomic weapons, employed over 130,000 people working in secret facilities across the continent. Humans had organized scientific research, industrial production, and military deployment on a scale that rivaled major galactic engineering projects. What disturbed Kethvar most was the tactical innovation. Tank warfare, combined arms operations, strategic bombing, submarine campaigns, amphibious assaults, airborne operations, and electronic warfare had all been developed and refined during these conflicts. Humans were learning lessons about warfare that most galactic species had never needed to consider. Even more troubling was human adaptability. When conventional tactics failed, they developed new approaches. When existing weapons proved inadequate, they invented better ones. When enemies developed countermeasures, humans found ways around them. The code-breaking efforts showed human intelligence applied to warfare in ways that impressed even Kethvar. Humans had learned to intercept and decode enemy communications, giving them strategic advantages that sometimes decided entire campaigns. The mathematical and technological sophistication required for this work rivaled anything in the galactic community. As Kethvar finished reading about World War II, he realized that these conflicts had involved more than military forces. Entire populations had been mobilized for war. Factory workers, farmers, scientists, and engineers had all contributed to the war effort. These wars had engaged human creativity, industrial capacity, and social organization on a total scale. The aftermath statistics were equally staggering. The Soviet Union lost over 20 million people. Poland lost over 15% of its total population. Some cities were so thoroughly destroyed that they had to be completely rebuilt. Yet humans had recovered from these devastating conflicts and continued developing both technologically and socially. The generation that fought World War II had gone on to explore space, develop computers, and create the global civilization that now sought council membership. Kethvar sat back in his chair, processing what he had learned. These weren't the military records of a peaceful, naive species. These were the chronicles of a civilization that had turned warfare into a science and practiced it with terrifying efficiency. The gentle humans he had met yesterday were descendants of people who had invented atomic weapons, strategic bombing, and industrial-scale murder. They carried the genetic heritage of warriors who had fought some of the most devastating conflicts in recorded history. Tomorrow he would read about more recent human military history. Kethvar found himself dreading what he might discover about these deceptively peaceful beings who now wanted to join the galactic community. Kethvar approached the terminal with growing dread. After learning about human industrial warfare, he hoped that modern conflicts would show more restraint and wisdom. Surely a species that had experienced such devastating wars would learn to avoid them in the future. Instead, he discovered that humans had spent the decades after World War II perfecting warfare into an art form. The Cold War period introduced concepts that challenged everything Kethvar thought he knew about military strategy. Humans had built enough nuclear weapons to destroy their entire planet several times over, then developed elaborate theories about how to use this capability without actually ending their civilization. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction involved deliberately creating conditions where any major conflict would result in the complete annihilation of all participants. Humans had weaponized their own extinction and used it as a diplomatic tool. Kethvar studied the Cuban Missile Crisis, where human leaders had brought their species to the edge of nuclear war over the placement of weapons on an island. For 13 days, two human superpowers had engaged in a contest of will that could have ended human civilization. They resolved the crisis through negotiation, but only after demonstrating their willingness to risk everything. The proxy wars of this period showed human strategic thinking at its most sophisticated. Unable to fight each other directly due to nuclear weapons, the superpowers fought through smaller conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and dozens of other locations. These weren't simple territorial disputes. They were games of global influence played with the lives of entire nations. The Korean War introduced concepts like limited war and political objectives that constrained military action. Human armies fought with weapons capable of devastating entire regions, yet maintained careful limits to prevent escalation to nuclear conflict. This required a level of strategic restraint and political control that impressed Kethvar despite the conflict's brutal nature. Vietnam demonstrated human persistence and adaptability in the face of unconventional warfare. A technologically superior military force found itself fighting an enemy that refused to engage in conventional battles. The conflict lasted over a decade and resulted in millions of casualties, yet taught humans valuable lessons about asymmetric warfare and the limitations of technological superiority. Kethvar was disturbed by human psychological warfare capabilities. Operations like MKULTR showed humans experimenting with mind control, interrogation techniques, and psychological manipulation. They had developed methods for breaking human will that went far beyond physical torture. The intelligence operations of this period revealed human spying capabilities that rivaled anything in the galactic community. Networks of agents, electronic surveillance, satellite reconnaissance, and code-breaking operations created information warfare systems of stunning sophistication. Humans had learned to fight wars in space before most of them had ever left their planet. Anti-satellite weapons, spy satellites, and communication networks turned orbital space into another battlefield domain. They understood that controlling space meant controlling the information flow that determined success in modern warfare. The evolution of human special forces particularly caught Kethvar's attention. Units like the Navy SEALs, British SAS, and Soviet Spetsnaz represented human warriors trained to operate independently behind enemy lines. These soldiers could survive in any environment, speak multiple languages, and accomplish missions that would challenge entire conventional units. Modern human soldiers were no longer just fighters. They were technicians, engineers, communicators, and analysts, all combined into single individuals. A typical Special Forces operator received training equivalent to several years of university education, plus physical conditioning that pushed human capabilities to their biological limits. The terrorist attacks of the early 21st century showed humans dealing with an entirely new form of warfare. Non-state actors using civilian aircraft as weapons, suicide bombers targeting population centers, and global networks of extremists operating without traditional military infrastructure. Human responses included creating entirely new military doctrines and intelligence capabilities. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrated human urban warfare capabilities. Fighting in cities required different tactics, equipment, and training than conventional battlefield operations. Humans developed new technologies like unmanned drones, improved body armor, and sophisticated communication systems specifically for these environments. Kethvar studied human drone warfare with growing unease. Humans could now conduct military operations from thousands of kilometers away, using robotic aircraft controlled by operators sitting in air-conditioned facilities. This technology allowed precise targeting of individuals anywhere on the planet, while minimizing risk to their own forces. The precision of modern human weapon systems astounded him. Guided missiles could strike specific rooms in buildings without damaging adjacent structures. Sniper rifles could eliminate targets at distances exceeding 2 kilometers. Artillery systems could place shells within meters of their intended targets from dozens of kilometers away. But technology was only part of the modern human military capability. Kethvar discovered that humans had developed military doctrines that treated warfare as a complex system, requiring integration of multiple domains: land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace. Network-centric warfare allowed human military units to share information instantly across global distances. A soldier on patrol in a remote location could call for support from aircraft, artillery, or orbital satellites within minutes. The coordination and communication capabilities rivaled those of hive-mind species. Human military education had evolved into sophisticated institutions that studied warfare as both science and art. War colleges analyzed historical conflicts to extract lessons for future battles. Military doctrine incorporated insights from psychology, economics, sociology, and engineering. The revolution in military affairs had transformed human armed forces into precision instruments capable of operating across multiple domains simultaneously. Information warfare, electronic attack, and cyber operations meant that humans could disrupt enemy capabilities without traditional kinetic weapons. What truly disturbed Kethvar was human military philosophy. Theorists like Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, and modern strategic thinkers had created frameworks for understanding warfare that went far beyond simple tactics. Humans understood war as the continuation of politics by other means, requiring careful integration of military action with diplomatic, economic, and social objectives. Human military planning involved scenarios for conflicts ranging from small-scale terrorist incidents to global nuclear war. They maintained forces capable of fighting multiple wars simultaneously in different regions of their planet. Strategic mobility allowed them to deploy significant military power anywhere on Earth within days. The concept of full-spectrum dominance meant humans sought to control all domains of warfare simultaneously. Land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace were all integrated into single operational concepts. No enemy could find sanctuary in any domain when fighting human forces operating at full capability. Modern human soldiers were equipped with technology that enhanced their natural capabilities dramatically. Night vision, thermal imaging, satellite navigation, and instant communication turned individual humans into information nodes in a larger military network. Body armor could stop projectiles that would penetrate most galactic personal protection systems. As Kethvar finished reading about contemporary human warfare, he realized that these beings had transformed conflict from a primitive struggle for resources into a sophisticated competition involving every aspect of their civilization. They had learned to fight wars with their minds as much as their weapons. The polite diplomats he had met were representatives of a species that had spent millennia perfecting the art of warfare. Every technological advancement, every social development, every educational achievement had been applied to making them more effective at organized violence. Tomorrow he would have to write his report for the Galactic Council. Kethvar no longer questioned whether humans. Kethvar sat before his terminal for hours without writing a single word. The empty report document glowed on the screen while he struggled to process everything he had learned about human military history. How could he possibly explain to the Galactic Council what these seemingly gentle beings were truly capable of? He thought about his own military service, which had seemed so impressive just days ago. The Great Battle of Kepler VII, where his unit had defeated a rebel army of 50,000 soldiers, was considered one of the largest conflicts in recent galactic history. Human armies had fought battles 10 times larger, using primitive weapons over 2,000 years ago. The siege of Arcturus Station, which lasted 4 months and resulted in 3,000 casualties, was studied in military academies as an example of prolonged warfare. Humans had fought battles that lasted years and killed millions of people, then continued fighting other wars the following decade. Kethvar had earned his highest decoration for tactical innovation during the Rigel campaign, where he had successfully coordinated attacks across 3 different fronts. Human generals had coordinated military operations across entire planets, managing supply lines that stretched across continents and timing attacks separated by thousands of kilometers. Every military achievement that had earned him respect and promotion seemed insignificant compared to what humans had accomplished routinely throughout their history. The scale, complexity, and intensity of human warfare exceeded anything in his experience or education. But the numbers alone didn't capture what truly disturbed him about human military capability. It wasn't just that they fought bigger wars or suffered more casualties. It was the way they approached warfare that set them apart from every other species in the galactic community. Humans treated war as an intellectual challenge to be solved through innovation and analysis. They studied their defeats more carefully than their victories, always seeking to understand what had gone wrong and how to improve. Every conflict became a learning opportunity for the next war. Most galactic species fought wars to achieve specific objectives: control of territory, access to resources, or resolution of political disputes. Once those objectives were achieved or proven impossible, the wars ended. Humans fought wars to reshape reality itself. The Mongols hadn't just wanted to control trade routes, they had wanted to create an empire that spanned continents. Romans hadn't just sought regional dominance, they had built a civilization that lasted over a millennium. Modern humans hadn't just developed nuclear weapons. They had created strategic doctrines that treated planetary annihilation as a negotiating position. Kethvar reviewed his notes about human tactical innovations throughout history. Phalanx formations, cavalry charges, siege warfare, naval battles, aerial combat, submarine operations, special forces infiltration, cyber warfare, and space-based operations. Humans had revolutionized military thinking in every domain where conflict was possible. But perhaps most disturbing was human psychological resilience in the face of warfare. Other species fought wars despite their costs. Humans seemed to fight wars because of their costs. The greater the challenge, the more resources they committed. The higher the casualties, the more determined they became. The concept of total war was uniquely human. No other species in the galactic community had ever mobilized their entire civilization for military purposes. Humans had done this repeatedly, transforming peaceful societies into war machines that could outproduce and outfight enemies with far larger populations. Kethvar thought about the quiet conversations he'd had with Ambassador Chen and the other human representatives. They had spoken about their military capabilities with apparent humility, acknowledging their technological limitations and expressing desire to learn from more advanced species. Now he understood that humility differently. These humans knew exactly how formidable they were. They simply saw no benefit in advertising it. They were predators who had learned to appear harmless until the moment they decided to strike. He began writing his report, then stopped and deleted everything after the first paragraph. How could he explain that humans had spent their entire history preparing for galactic warfare without realizing it? Every human conflict had taught them lessons that applied to larger scales and more advanced technologies. Human understanding of logistics, communication, intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and tactical innovation was centuries ahead of most galactic military thinking. They had solved problems that other species didn't even know existed yet. The small human military forces that had seemed so modest during his briefings took on new significance. Those few hundred starships represented the space-capable forces of a species that could probably build thousands more within a few years if they decided it was necessary. Human industrial capacity during their world wars had been truly staggering. Human soldiers who seemed primitive because they still used kinetic weapons were actually masters of the most versatile and reliable military technology ever developed. Energy weapons could be disrupted, shields could be penetrated, but a bullet fired from a human rifle would hit its target, regardless of electronic countermeasures or exotic physics. Kethvar remembered Admiral Thompson's presentation about human space fleet capabilities. The Admiral had mentioned that their ships were designed for extended independent operations and capable of rapid role modification. At the time, this had seemed like euphemisms for technological limitations. Now he realized these were exactly the capabilities needed for interstellar warfare. Human ships weren't built for impressive display. They were built for effectiveness in environments where resupply was impossible, and mission requirements could change instantly. The human marines he had observed during his tour carried equipment that seemed primitive compared to galactic standard energy weapons, but their weapons were also self-contained. Ammunition was easily manufactured, and the weapons functioned in any environment without external power sources. Human combat doctrine emphasized individual initiative and adaptability over rigid adherence to plans. Their soldiers were trained to continue fighting even when cut off from command and control. This was exactly the mindset needed for conflicts across interstellar distances, where communication delays made centralized control impossible. Kethvar finally understood what Ambassador Chen had meant about humans not always being at their best. The gentle, diplomatic humans he had met were not representative of what their species became during wartime. They had shown him their civilized faces while their military records revealed something far more dangerous lurking beneath the surface. He thought about the Council's discussions regarding human membership. Most representatives viewed humans as a minor species that might provide useful research capabilities or serve as neutral mediators in disputes between major powers. They saw human technological limitations and peaceful demeanor as evidence of a harmless, potentially useful junior partner. They had no idea they were considering membership for a species that had turned warfare into their highest art form. Kethvar began writing again, crafting his words carefully. The Council needed to understand what humans represented, but they also needed to understand the opportunity this created. If humans could be brought into the Council structure as allies, they would become the most formidable military asset in galactic history. But if humans were rejected or threatened, they would eventually become the most dangerous enemy the galaxy had ever faced. It was only a matter of time before they developed advanced technology to match their tactical sophistication. His recommendation was clear: immediate acceptance of human membership, with full voting rights and access to galactic technology. The Council needed these humans as friends, because having them as enemies would be a disaster beyond imagination. As he submitted his report, Kethvar realized that his 3 centuries of military service had just become far more interesting. He was no longer just a veteran warrior. He was now the galactic expert on human military capability. The galaxy was about to change in ways that none of them could fully comprehend yet. Belonged in the galactic community. He questioned whether the galaxy was ready for humans.